Is it possible to have a free society after the manifest tyranny that we're experiencing in the coronavirus crisis? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for libertarianism. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who's an economics professor at the Citadel, longtime libertarian. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be able to get together with you and our viewers and listeners in a proper social distancing, because I wouldn't want to get in trouble with the powers that be. In fact, I had to send in my textbook orders for next semester to the college bookstore, and I assured the fellow who's in charge of it that I clicked the mouse sufficiently 6 feet away from the computer screen.
That is excellent. I want you to know that I'm keeping myself 6 feet from the computer screen while I'm talking to you. So everything is good. If you're new,
you should just be able to feel privileged to be in the company of being 6 feet away from me on the screen.
All right. Well, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org and subscribe here to our YouTube channel. Okay, Richard, when we started the Future of Freedom Foundation 30 years ago, I was the president, I was the founder, you were the vice president of academic affairs. At the time, you were the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College. And we were talking in our early months of our monthly journal, which was at that time called Freedom Daily, and today is called Future of Freedom, about the massive tyranny under which we were suffering in America at that time. What are you laughing about?
It's okay. Now it's a nostalgia of almost a laissez-faire environment.
Right.
90, a laissez-faire environment. The Bush Senior.
Yeah. Oh, for those wonderful halcyon days of 1990s when we were really living in a free society under the Clinton administration. I mean, it's just amazing because, whenever you think things can't really get worse,
they do.
They do. I mean, when would you have ever thought that we'd be living in this dictatorial mindset of a society? I mean, you look at these mayors and governors and presidents and congressmen, and there's that DNA that's coming out in them, that dictatorial DNA. And this is like the perfect opportunity for this. That they're just it's exuding from their skin. It's incredible, all the acts of tyranny that are taking place with this crisis, and it's right. The perfect opportunity because you've got an economic crisis, which is entirely caused by them, by shutting down all these businesses and putting people into bankruptcy. I mean, they're breaking people.
Oh yeah, they are.
I'm sorry?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean,
I was just remembering to put my earbuds in.
Okay. Well, you've got like a sick patient, and you say, well, let's give him arsenic to try to get him well. And it's phenomenal because then you've got this dysfunctional healthcare system. You've got the dysfunctional monetary system. And then as everything's cracking apart, I mean, everything is literally cracking apart. I mean, they don't have the money to do all these things that they're doing. The stimulus plan, you think they have $2 trillion hanging around or $4 trillion? And so here they are massively printing the money to fund all this stuff. I mean, they've got the printing presses cranked up 24 hours a day. How can this not have an effect, a massive effect, around the corner on devaluation of money? I mean, we're looking at really a perfect storm of their whole system, 100 years of statism coming apart at the seams. And what happens when their system starts coming apart? Breaking apart and causing untold misery and suffering and impoverishment and bankruptcy. that's when they resort to the crackdowns. That's when they don't want people speaking out. They don't want people criticizing them. That's why the Justice Department is already over there asking Congress to give them the authority to lock people up without due process, because they're anticipating that as this thing starts to crack apart, people are going to start dissenting. They're going to start thinking, I need to get my business going. I got family, I got children, and so forth. I'm well. No, you're not. You're going to sit at home because we're telling you to sit at home. We're ordering you to sit at home. And that's when the tyranny really comes through. So why don't I turn it over to you now and talk about some of the specific acts of tyranny that you're witnessing across the country?
Well, let's remember that under our federal system of government, there are a set of limited enumerated functions for the national or the federal government in Washington, D.C. to do. But most of these responsibilities, if the federal structure of our system is abided by, does reside with the states and the localities and the people themselves. So that much of what we see in terms of these stay-at-home orders, these shutdowns, lockdowns, whatever phraseology you want to use, have been occurring under the mandate of the state government, which is institutionally consistent with the federalist structure, as opposed to a president asserting that it's his responsibility or right to either close or open down a system. It is the responsibility of those who hold governor or local offices in our structure. That doesn't defend them doing it, but institutionally, that's the way it's set up in the Constitution. Now, given this, the fact is, across the country, many state governments, under the leadership and the direction of their respective governors, have followed draconian methods, in some states extremely extreme, where everything has been shut down, where stores have been told not only that they must only be serving customers for essential items, but they must cordon off certain lanes or parts of the store because the state government has deemed these are non-essential items, non-essential goods. That even buying some gardening supplies, that while you're home alone under the lockdown and have nothing to do, and you're in your backyard, certainly far more than 6 feet away from any of your neighbors, you can't even buy the plant or the flowers to do some gardening in your own backyard. That's how absurd this is. The media has shown the situation where several Sunday services are being held, particularly over the Easter Sunday weekend, or not only that, where some churches in southern states decided to hold services and just do it in the old fashion of like a drive-in theater, where people are in their cars, obviously 6 feet away from each other, and they've been ticketed with heavy fines. There was one gentleman, I forget what state it was in, was out taking his son for a walk, and he was ticketed and threatened with arrest just for taking his kid for a walk in an empty space. Another fellow was jogging on an empty beach, and he was threatened with arrest for doing this. We see that in certain areas now they're using drones to patrol areas. Now, where have we really seen this all recently? Communist China. The flu broke out, this virus broke out in Wuhan, a major city of several millions of people in central China. And after they could no longer cover it up and deny that this was going on, what did the Chinese do? Well, they're a communist totalitarian regime when they want to be. The entire city was shut down. People were ordered to stay indoors. If people were found outdoors, they were arrested. They were beaten. They were put into their apartment buildings, and the doors were sealed. And the drones would be out. And loudspeakers, obviously, in the Chinese language, would be telling people, get off the street. You're being observed. You'll be arrested. I mean, what more like Orwell's 1984? Big Brother is watching everywhere and commanding you. Now, this is the model, perversely, that governments all over the world, Italy, Spain, France, and the states of the United States in our constitutional structure have been implementing to varying and different degrees. But this is anathema to the very notions of due process, of the rights and freedoms of the individual, of our notions of abiding by the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights may be in our Constitution, but virtually every state constitution has their sort of parallel version of a Bill of Rights. So it's not just the federal law versus state law, and the state law being able to avoid freedom of speech or freedom of association. Virtually every state constitution, I've not read every one, but virtually every state constitution has their own, shadow version or parallel version of the Bill of Rights. This is all being abridged under the arbitrary assertion of a political figure sitting in a state gubernatorial mansion, declaring that they have the authority to act as an unlimited monarch, a democratically elected monarch, but no less a monarch. And this is not only, I would argue, the wrong way to deal with this terrible and serious virus. People are dying. It clearly is easily contagious. It is affecting certain demographic categories more than others. And because so many can be asymptomatic, they may not know that they have it and can share it with friends or loved ones in ways that they would never intentionally want to do so, threatening their harm. But that is not the way to deal with this, in my humble opinion. We've talked about this before in a few other episodes of the show. But the fact is that the state has taken upon itself to impose a centralized command and control system where and the dictates about what can be produced, who can work, what can be sold. This is almost a caricature of a fully centrally planned economy, where the individual is the cog in the machine who is told how, what, where, and when, and over which they have almost no personal freedom or autonomy to act the way they want. Now, my concern, and I know it is yours too, Bumper, that Jacob, when this thing passes, and hopefully, and it will it sooner rather than later, and we supposedly start returning to whatever becomes known as normal again, the precedents will have been established. What are some of those precedents? Can take another moment or two to elaborate some of them as I see it. That in a health emergency like this, it is the duty, the responsibility, and in quote marks, the right of some level of government to impose draconian, totalitarian restrictions on the movement and actions of the citizens under their jurisdiction, regardless of what a federal or a state constitution may say on the printed page. In other words, we no longer have constitutional law, no longer a rule of law, or rule of law as opposed to men, that even those who rule are obligated to follow by the procedures and the respecting of the rights that they are supposedly elected to secure and protect. Psychologically, socially, and politically, and economically, these are bad precedents that will be established. And our liberty will have been lost to some degree, even when we return to whatever becomes the new normal. And the government will have more power than it had before. And the arrogant presumption that the next time something happens, whatever it may be, this has set the tone and the stage for them to do what they've been doing now, but maybe even more.
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points. With respect to the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. I mean, it governs what the federal government can do and cannot do. I mean, that was the whole purpose of the charter, is to say, okay, if you all approve this, they were the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia were saying, if you all approve this, you don't need to worry about this government getting out of control because we've enumerated its powers here. And people were very leery. I mean, they'd been operating under the Articles of Confederation for more than 10 years. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government, and they had a federal government, did not even have the power to tax. Imagine operating under a federal government with no power to tax for more than 10 years. And so when they meet at the convention, it's with the idea of amending it. There had been some problems, trade wars between the states and so forth. Well, but instead of amending the articles, they came out with this new proposal. And so people were very leery. They were afraid that we'd end up with a government the likes of which we have today on the federal level, on the state level, and local level, with all these little dictocrats and totalitarian rulers in their own little domains. And so they said, well, okay, we'll go along with the deal, but we want to make certain about this, at least with respect to the federal government. And so we have the Bill of Rights, which really should have been just called a Bill of Prohibitions, because it prohibits the government from taking away freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, right to keep and bear arms. It says if you target one of us with punishment, you have to provide due process of law, trial by jury, and all these other procedural protections. But what they're saying with that is, we know you're going to do these kind of things. This is why we're expressly putting it in this, because we know that government attracts the little dictocrats in society. And there's always the little dictocrats in society. And they're attracted to government power. They can't help themselves. I think it's a psychological problem. And so, but what's fascinating is our ancestors understood this. And that was why they had the Bill of Rights, because they knew this was going to happen. And the message was, we want to make it clear that you don't have the authority to do this. You might do it, but you don't have our authority. And notice that there was no crisis or emergency exception in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, because they knew that crises and emergencies are the time-honored way by which people lose their liberty to their own government. They understood that the greatest threat to the freedom and well-being of a citizenry lies with their own government, not some foreign threat, not the terrorists or the Muslims and the Catholics or whoever. It's always with your own government. And crises and emergencies are the time-honored way where that happens, because people get afraid and the government says, well, look, we're going to take away your freedoms, but just temporarily, and then we're going to keep you safe. Well, how safe have they kept us from this coronavirus? I mean, it's a disaster. They've got this centrally planned healthcare system, which you and I have been objecting to for 30 years, Richard. I mean, you can go back to our early articles in Freedom Daily, and we were saying, you got to get rid of this system. It's a bad system. You've got to go with us if you want all these crises to be eliminated. Come with us with a free market philosophy. And people through all those years, Richard, you recall, oh, you guys are so radical. Oh, it's just so radical at FFF. Well, it's not radical at all. It never appeared radical to me. It's just liberty. I mean, what's radical about people being free? Well, if we'd adopted a free market system to address this crisis, I mean, a pandemic, I mean, it's no different in principle from a hurricane or a tornado or any kind of natural disaster. The question is, how does a society confront something like this? You can confront it with a centrally planned governmental system, or you can confront it with a free market system where government has no role in it. And there's no doubt at all that if we'd had a free market system like you and I have been advocating, addressing this healthcare threat, the death toll would be significantly lower. Because as they're figuring out, the secret to this thing is testing. That imagine in a free market, you wouldn't have shortage of testing kits and masks and ventilators or anything, because entrepreneurs would be flooding into the market immediately to provide these things. They wouldn't have to check with a bureaucrat. They wouldn't have to go to the FDA and say, would you support and approve my testing kit? Well, we'll have to wait for a year because we have a backlog right now. No, entrepreneurs would be flooding into these things. You'd have ratings on which were the best testing kits immediately online. You'd have Amazon flooding American households with 100 testing kits at $2 each, overnight delivery. Then everybody would be testing on a regular basis, and you'd know who was positive. Everybody else is still well, could go in there and support their businesses, keep surviving, providing for their families. I mean, it's the perfect solution. We would be looking to the healthcare industry, the professionals, to guide us out, lead us out of this crisis. And that's their expertise, addressing a healthcare crisis. This is not the expertise of a politician or bureaucrat. And so everything would be different. And instead, we face this crisis now. And what's the answer? Tyranny. Because their system doesn't work. And this is when you referred to the Soviet Union. I mean, this is exactly what would happen. Their central planning system would break down. There'd be shortages, or what Mises called planned chaos. And what do then? They start cracking down on people. That's where the tyranny comes into play. This is what the Chinese do. They start shutting down people who are criticizing them, criticizing how they're handling it, disclosing the truth about what's going on. They immediately start rounding them up and arresting them. And ultimately, this is what we're looking at in this thing. I mean, this is the climax. I consider this the ultimate climax of their dysfunctional systems on the economy, healthcare, and central planning. And to a certain extent, education as well, because that's where people get all this indoctrination into believing that government's going to save them if they just trade their liberty. Well, as we've learned throughout history, you trade your liberty away for security and you end up with neither one. And it's a fool's bargain. It never works. And as Bob Higgs has pointed out, you always end up with a worse situation after the crisis with respect to liberty than you were in before the crisis. And so with each crisis, and this ain't the last one, with each crisis, the omnipotent government control, the destruction of liberty in this land is solidified even more.
Well, of course, they are seeing, the government is seeing a very serious crisis. The New York Times, the Washington Post has written about it, and it's causing concern and anxiety and fear. The U.S. Postal Service may have to be privatized.
Oh my gosh, are you serious?
Yes, it's running a terrible deficit. People are not communicating with each other in snail mail as much as is needed to cover their costs of production. And horror of horrors, it may have to be closed down or privatized. I mean, that would obviously be the worst victim of the coronavirus crisis, the public government ownership of the post office. I mean, oh, the horror. But the thing is that, there are silver linings if people were to pick up with them. The fact that you see there are lessons to be learned about the heavy-handedness of government, precisely because the FDA and the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, were so rigidly top-down and controlling, delaying the development of alternative ventilators, hand sanitizers, the masks, and gloves, and so on. They finally had to relent and allow in the degrees of greater latitude of local and decentralized and private development and marketing and offering of these things. The fact that, a doctor has to be licensed in the state in which they want to practice medicine. New York has been suffering from a lack of trained medical personnel because of the percentage of victims that they've had in their state, particularly the New York City area. They've had to loosen that. A doctor licensed in a different state might be able to practice the same medicine in New York. I mean, how can you be sure he knows how to take someone's temperature? He has his degree from a school in a different state. Oh, the horror. Well, the lessons here is that we don't need these regulations. These regulations are impediments, hindrances, and barriers to the adaptability, the flexibility, the dynamism of putting desired and needed goods and personnel where they are needed, as would be reflected on the circumstances of that place and time, and would be reflected in the demand to buy things urgently and looking down the road. That is why we need open, free, competitive markets and institutions of civil society that have their rules and regulations of associations, but not the rigid prohibitions, controls, and restrictions that you see with government heavy-handed determination of, well, you can be a doctor in this town, but if you cross that line right next to that town into the next state, sorry, you're not qualified to be a doctor. I mean, this is madness. And if people understand this, there can be positive lessons to be learned about the ludicrousness and the absurdity and the damage caused by government expected and dictating the right to control, regulate, determine, and specify who can do this, what can be produced, by whom, where, and how it may be sold. So there are little historical lessons to be learned in this that hopefully that enough people will pick up, and that can be a slight silver lining when all of this is passed away.
Yeah, I think your concept of a free market is really important for us to focus on and analyze carefully because, primarily as a result of indoctrination in public schools, Americans believe that they live in a free enterprise country. This is a free market society, and that term is just so loosely used. Oh yeah, I'm a free enterprise guy. I go to the Chamber of Commerce meetings and so forth, and everybody thinks, hey, yeah, I'm free enterprise. I'm pro free enterprise, and yet the truth is that you've got these central planning apparatuses that are the exact opposite of a free market. Now, to put things in a historical context, which you like to do sometimes, I mean, if you go back to the Middle Ages and so forth, governments always regulated these kind of things. I mean, that was the standard thing, regulating economic activity, anti-gouging laws, anti-speculation laws, anti-profiteering laws. They were all designed to protect the poor from the greedy, rapacious profiteer. But then all of a sudden Adam Smith comes along with his famous book in 1776, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, and raises this revolutionary notion. It just says, hey, why don't we essentially separate economy and the state? In other words, free market activity from government interference. Entirely. I mean, that's why it's called free enterprise or free markets. It's enterprise that the government doesn't interfere with, doesn't direct, doesn't plan. It just happens by itself. The French term for this was laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Let it be, let it pass. Just get out of the way. Well, I think it's so important for people to reflect on that because it really is a revolutionary notion in terms of where we are today. You've got a centrally planned healthcare system, a centrally planned economic system, a centrally planned monetary system that are all the total opposites of freedom and free enterprise. And that if we really had a free enterprise system, people would be free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth. There would be no forcible caring of anybody. Charity would be 100% voluntary. Think how much people would have in their bank accounts if they hadn't been paying income taxes for the last 20 years. Let's say an average family pays $10,000 a year in income taxes. They'd have $200,000 in savings right now. That's enough to get you through a few months of unemployment. You have a total free market healthcare system. No FDA, no Centers for Disease Control. The entrepreneurs, healthcare entrepreneurs, no licensing laws, as you point out. There would be no restrictions on healthcare providers flooding into the market. Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate libertarian economist, made this case against medical licensure in his book Capitalism and Freedom. And then you've got a free market monetary system. I mean, what we're talking about is monumental change, what might be called a paradigm shift. That's what we're challenging Americans to do. And we're in the midst of this crisis. This is the time to do the soul searching. This is the time to decide. Because, Richard, I think there's a good possibility that come November and December and January and February, even if this thing dies down in the summer, this thing could come back big time in those months. And so we need to start in this country building the foundation that you and I have been trying to build for 30 years at FFF, and that you've been doing with your work at the Hillsdale College and at the Foundation for Economic Education, at the Citadel, Northwood. I mean, building the foundation for the future. You can't do anything about the past, but you can build a foundation for the future. And that foundation's got to be built on freedom and free enterprise if we're going to get this country back on the right road.
Yeah, if I can sort of pick up on your last remarks. History is never just the facts. Maybe some viewers and listeners remember the old television show Dragnet with Sergeant Joe Friday. And there was that cliche line that when people would start going off on tangents that he was talking to, he'd, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Well, there are the facts, but facts never speak for themselves. They're put into a narrative, a story. It's like if someone goes and testifies in a court, and the person is sitting in the box, and the attorney says, "Well, give us the facts." Well, I was born in a log cabin. No. That's not the facts of the case. Facts are chosen to the circumstances of the story or narrative that you're concerned with. A crime is a story. It's a narrative. Who did what to whom, when, and how, and not whether someone else was crossing the street or over in the restaurant having a ham sandwich. No. What are the facts relative to the causal events we're trying to analyze? That is what every history is. It's a narrative. How the facts are selected, how they're linked together, the causalities that are seen in them, and therefore what the story tells us is important, because others will then either learn from or be told those narratives in the future. And that's how they'll see the past. Think of the 1930s. Was the Great Depression caused by misguided monetary policy in the 1920s and exacerbated with government interventions, regulations, and controls first by Hoover and then more intensively by Franklin Roosevelt? No. It was something inherent in the market. And it was unbridled capitalism. And Herbert Hoover was just this do-nothing guy. And then Franklin Roosevelt, he just wanted to save America by doing X, Y, and Z. That's the story every child learns in school. And every adult, unfortunately, takes for granted. But it's not the facts as understood in a different and, in my opinion, better narrative. Now, what will be the story of the coronavirus crisis? Will it be that government screwed things up, its heavy-handedness, its regulatory rigidity, its misdirected lockdowns, its causing of this tragic collapse of output, employment, and savings due to prohibitions on work, trading, associating? Okay, or will it be, well, the market couldn't be trusted. The government had to step in at a moment of crisis because freedom doesn't work. It's okay in normal times, that supply and demand stuff, but someone might go out on a beach when they're not supposed to. Oh no, government saved us from the end of the world. Now, what narrative correctly and more accurately tells the facts, and which of those narratives will prevail in the years ahead? That is why it is so important to explain to our fellow citizens, my opinion, how this came about. Why has it gotten to the point it is? What has damaged the economy? What has delayed and retarded the ability of the medical sector from being more adaptive and flexible and adjusting to this unexpected circumstance? You know, Friedrich Hayek, the famous Austrian economist, Nobel Prize winner, once pointed out in his introduction to a book called Capitalism and the Historians, that historians have more power and influence than any of us imagine. In fact, more than most other social scientists, because it's their stories that become embedded in our minds, reading on our own, learning in schools, that determine how we see the past, and that dictates and guides us how we select in the future. So getting this story right, that it is the government that has been the problem and not solution, is paramountly important for all friends of liberty right now.
I totally agree with you. And I think if there was ever a need, a demand for leadership in libertarianism, it's now. And that what we as libertarians need to do is just speak the truth, even if it offends people, even if it's just like shocking to them. Oh my gosh, you all are so radical. That this is the time for leadership, and leadership requires being truthful about where we are as a country and what is needed to get out of it. I mean, when you go to a physician, you want that physician to tell you the truth. If he finds a tumor, you don't want him to say, oh, it's just a stomach ache, oh, take some Rolaids and you'll be fine. As bad as the news is, you want the truth. And then, because then the doctor can say, well, this is what we need to do. We need to excise this tumor. Well, doctor, is it possible to remove the tumor? Yeah, but you're going to go through a difficult recovery period here. Well, will I be well at the end of this? Yes, absolutely. But if you leave the tumor there, you'll be comfortable, but it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Well, that's what we're dealing with here, Richard. We're the physicians for the body politic. And we have to just tell the patient the truth, that this is your tumor on your body politic. If you leave it there, you're in deep trouble, because it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and it's going to take your life away and your business, and you're going to go bankrupt, and you're going to end up in this tyrannical regime. You want out, You got to remove this tyranny, this tumor. You can't modify it. You can't reform it. You try to kind of polish it and hold it in check. You got to remove it. Does that mean that the recovery will be difficult? Absolutely. But at the end of that recovery, now we're talking about a free, prosperous, healthy, harmonious society.
Yes, and all we can hope for is that even in times of tragedy, because people are dying who, if not for the virus, would not be dying, even in the best of circumstances, if the government hadn't done this, some people would tragically die from this. But even in the tragedy of this and people's concerns, anxieties, and focus on the immediacy of things, we need to place this in the context of keeping our reason and our heads calm as best we can, and to think about the policies, the institutions, the principles, and how we want America to be when we come out of this. And as I was suggesting, to learn the right historical lessons, the narrative of how and why, so that we don't go through the same disastrous, wrong-headed policies again.
All right. On that fine note, we'll wrap it up. Enjoyed the visit, as I always do, Richard, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and to all of our viewers and listeners, stay safe and stay well.
Yeah, thank you all very much for tuning in. I repeat what Richard just said. Stay well, and we'll come out of this, hopefully, a much freer society. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Come to visit us at fff.org. Send us some emails if you have any questions. We respond to all of them. Sometimes we're a little bit late, but we respond to all of them. And we'll see you all next week.
Bye-bye.